Welcome everyone. This is DC Public Schools Learning at Home lessons for 9th grade World History 1. We are looking at the second part of Unit 8, so we're looking at the idea of reason and the Enlightenment. And the big question that we're looking at is, were the Enlightenment revolutions really enlightened? First, we just want to say we are hoping you are continuing to stay safe and healthy while we engage in distance learning. Over these next 2 weeks, you will have an opportunity to learn about the Enlightenment and the quote-unquote enlightened revolutions. If you need the materials that we're going to be talking about today, here is a link for you to access them. All right, first we need to talk about what was the Enlightenment. So the Enlightenment was a period when new ideas about government, personal freedom, and religious beliefs developed in Europe throughout the 17th to the 19th century. Now, if you've been participating in Learning at Home for your World History 1 class, you will have talked about the Renaissance and how the Renaissance brought the idea of humanism, the belief that humans could use reason to understand and solve the problems of the world. This is different from the period that we learned about the Middle Ages in Europe, when really people looked to God and Christianity to try to understand and solve all their problems, right? So if we take the issues that we're having with COVID-19 right now, during the Middle Ages, people might have said, okay, God must be punishing us, right? What can we do to please God to make this go away, right? During the idea of humanism, and which follows through to today, we look at, okay, what's the science? What's the reason the virus started? How did it spread? How do we come up with a vaccine, right? These are human, intelligent beings helping us solve these problems of the world. During the Enlightenment, they also believed in the idea of natural law. This is the idea, kind of like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights with the United Nations, that there are things that apply to all people, no matter where you live or who you are. So, for example, an example of a natural law would be parents are responsible for caring for their children. We all believe that, right? Life is sacred. Do no harm. Try to help those who are struggling. Those are things I think no matter where you live and who you are, they are universal and unchanging principles. So, we are looking at the first part of this unit. What did Enlightenment thinkers believe the role of government should be? Okay, so for this part of the lesson, you're going to read and annotate sources. The sources are some of these enlightened thinkers, their original documents. So you're going to read and annotate those. You're going to answer some analysis questions, complete a graphic organizer, and then answer some summary questions. So let's do A together as an example. So for our example, we're going to be looking at Thomas Hobbes. He was one of the first English Enlightenment philosophers, and he believed in a strong government based on reason. Okay, so let's just look at a few parts of what he wrote. First, he said, nature has made men so equal in with regards to the body and mind that the difference between man to another man is not so considerable. So now what is that key idea? The idea there is that men are equal, meaning people are equal, right? And then he said, from this equality of ability comes an equality of hope in attaining our goals and desires. If two men desire the same thing, they compete and become enemies. When this happens, if there's no common power to keep them in check, they will engage in war, right? So the key idea there is men will fight each other if they want the same thing. That's going to lead to war, right? So then we go to our third paragraph. I'm just going to kind of summarize, is the key idea of that is that war prevents society from flourishing. If a society is in a state of war, you can't, he says here, there are no arts, there are no letters, there are no books. Life is going to be short, it's going to be cruel, right? And finally, he said, if you want to live a happier life and get out of this miserable condition of war, you must obey rulers with absolute power. That's what Thomas Hobbes believed, right? So, if Thomas Hobbes could create government, what would he want it to look like? Well, he would want a ruler with absolute power. He would not necessarily believe in giving representation to the people. And what is it quotes that support that is men must give up their freedom to the state, meaning to the government, and the power of the state. When they say state here, they mean the government must be absolute. So he believed in absolute power. So you're going to do the same thing for the remaining sources. Key ideas, what would this philosopher want government to look like, and what are some supporting quotes? Now, going to your next section, we're going to look at how did the ideas from the Enlightenment, those ideas that we just discussed, contribute to revolutions around the world? So, let's review. Enlightenment ideas, what were they? Humans have the ability to understand and solve world problems, right? All problems are not going to be solved by God. Natural law applies to all humans, right? We all believe that you should protect people's lives, that you should help children. And let's remind ourselves, what was the political order at the time? At that time, you had mostly kings and queens ruling. You had monarchies and empires. You had often absolutism, where a ruler has absolute power, and he believed that that power was given by God. We also had colonialism happening at that time. The British controlled the 13 colonies. Spain and Portugal controlled many countries in the Americas. We had enslavement happening at that time, and the decision makers were white men with land and money. So now, how did those ideas and the political order at the time contribute to revolutions? Well, a revolution in this case is to overthrow the government by force. So let's look and see a little bit more about that. So for this particular part of the unit, you are going to read and annotate 3 sources. One is about the French Revolution, one is about the revolution in Haiti and the Caribbean, and then you're going to talk about some revolutions in South America. Finally, for that, you're going to complete a graphic organizer. All right, so let's do an example together. We are going to look at the revolution that came first in the Americas, and that's the American Revolution. Of course, that's the one that we're also the most familiar with. So, the American Revolution, when you do your graphic organizer, you're going to need to put this information in it. So, the American Revolution happened between 1775 and 1787. These are some of the key leaders from the American Revolution. And if you remember back to your 8th grade history class, the 13 colonies in the U.S. were ruled by the British monarchy, so by the British king and queen. The Americans felt that they should not be taxed without representation and should have the same rights as the British. So that's how you ended up with the Boston Tea Party and other events that happened where people are protesting. Why should we pay this money to the British? We have no say-so in our government, right? And so leaders who had a problem with that issued a Declaration of Rights saying every citizen should have life, liberty, property, assembly, that meaning being able to gather in groups, and trial by jury, that these are all things that we deserve. Now, this American Revolution, how did it reflect the ideals of the Enlightenment? Well, people who were rebelling against the British believed that people have the ability to solve their own problems. That's the idea of humanism. And these natural rights, saying you cannot deny us our rights. We have inalienable rights, rights that cannot be taken away. Now, some people could argue as a counterclaim. They could say, well, the American Revolution actually wasn't that enlightened because the rights fought for in the American Revolution only applied to white men with land or wealth. So they're saying, okay, you're letting some people, if the natural rights apply to everyone, how is this revolution an example of an enlightenment? So that's something that some might argue. All right, now getting into week 9. So far we've learned what is the Enlightenment, who were Enlightenment thinkers, and then we looked at revolutions where people use the idea of the Enlightenment to try to overthrow the government. So now we're looking at the question of, did the governments formed by the enlightened revolutions reflect the ideals of the Enlightenment? So maybe the revolution itself reflected it, but then what about the actual governments that were formed after the revolution? So for this particular part of the lesson, you're going to read and annotate 3 primary sources. You're going to look at the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen. That came out of the French Revolution. You're going to look at excerpts from the Haitian Constitution of 1801. That's coming out of the Haitian Revolution. And you're going to look at Jamaica Letter from 1815 as an example of other revolutions happening in Latin America, right? You're going to complete a chart where you analyze those 3 documents, and then you are going to read and annotate source M and complete a chart. So let's stick with the American Revolution. Let's do an example together of what you're being asked to do. Okay? So when you're looking at the document of the Declaration of Independence, right? In the other ones, you're going to be looking at documents from the French Revolution, the Haitian Revolution, the Latin American Revolution. Here we're looking at the American Revolution. So we have the speakers, the writers of that document. Thomas Jefferson wrote the original document, and then John Adams and Benjamin Franklin offered revisions. It was on July 4th, 1776, right? That's why we celebrate the 4th of July every year. When we declared our independence from the British. This is a government document. Now, to what extent does the revolutionary primary source reflect the ideas of the Enlightenment? Let's look at an excerpt from the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from consent of the governed. So, how does this excerpt from the Declaration of Independence reflect the ideals of the Enlightenment? Here's an example of what you might write. The American Revolution reflected the ideals of the Enlightenment in the Declaration of Independence because it states that men are, quote, endowed with certain inalienable rights. Remember, we talked about in the Enlightenment, they believed in that natural law, that there are some laws, doesn't matter who you are, where you live, what your government is, applies to everyone. This reflects John Locke's ideal of living with natural rights, and that those natural rights include life, liberty, meaning freedom, and that you can own property. Now, at the very end of the unit, you are going to complete a performance task where you write a 5-paragraph argumentative essay. The prompt: were the goals and outcomes of so-called enlightened revolutions truly enlightened? Draw on evidence from the primary and secondary sources included in this unit. So you can use this T-chart where you gather your evidence and your sources, and you say, okay, this one actually, yes, it did follow the ideals of the Enlightenment. Here you're saying no, right? Use that to help you plan. And when you're writing your claim, this is kind of levels of difficulty, right? From mild to spicy. And this is giving you some sentence starters to get started with your claim writing. So I hope that the lesson goes well for you and you have all the documents that you need. Please reach out to your teachers for any additional questions. Have a great day.